Hi, welcome to Ludocriticism. Today we're going to talk about my favorite subject, failure.
Oh, you just lost a lot of progress. That's a deep frustration, a real punch in the gut.
The central question today, though, is why do we play games in the first place? There are, of course, aesthetic reasons as to why we play games. We like looking at pictures, we like listening to noise, and we like watching them work together to say something. These reasons are the same reasons we read, watch films, or otherwise engage with art. The unique components to games are the ludic elements, but what exactly are those? Also, why do different games appeal to different people, and why is that difference pretty consistent for the same people over different games? If somebody were to ask me on Twitter which two questions my channel is most interested in, okay, that's not gonna happen anytime soon, but if it were, it would be these two questions. And I think that over the past month or so, I've figured out, if not an answer, then at least a constructive way of talking about these two phenomena in the first place. I want you to make a note of what is displayed on the screen. We won't talk about it right now, but it's going to be really important later, okay? Okay. In his 2013 book, The Art of Failure, Jesper Juul formulates and develops his idea of the failure paradox. Basically, Juul says, we tend to avoid failure as human beings, but even though we experience failure when playing games, we seek them out. What gives? Juul is, of course, right that almost all games revolve around the tension that exists between success and failure, and his book goes on to lay out the art, as it were, of how games do this well. For example, he explains preventing a person from doing what they want in real life is considered rude, but when a game does the same, it's fun. How does that work? That's what his book is ultimately about, and if you think that sort of thing is interesting, you should read it. I instead want to focus on a stipulation Juul makes early in the book, and the implications it carries with it. On page 7, Juul makes the following claim about games. They promise us that we can repair a personal fallacy, an inadequacy that they produce in us in the first place. In other words, a failure tells us that we are still lacking, whereas a success tells us we no longer are. Juul makes from the first part of the sentence the appropriate conclusion that a game needs to motivate us to keep playing, and the designer's job is to toe the line between playful obstruction of the player's goal and downright sadism. The problem, though, is with the second part of the sentence, that the games produce the inadequacy in us in the first place, because I'm ultimately not sure I agree this is always the case. Bundling these two separate ideas together, that a game promises we can repair a personal inadequacy and that a game creates it in the first place, is incorrect, because only if the game creates that inadequacy does it need to motivate us to keep playing. If instead, a game is capitalizing on an inadequacy which is already there, there's really no need. The problem with Juul's argument is how he assumes there is no space for a game to help us with something which is already within us, profound, and able to affect our lives. And I think that's a shame, because it changes everything. Later in the book, Juul asks, when is a game structure useful and when is it detrimental? Now that's a really general question, and I'd ask useful or detrimental in relation to what? And isn't there a space between those two where a game can be neither? I wouldn't call a game that creates an inadequacy, I bet you can't get to the end of this level, you loser, for me to repair detrimental, because I might enjoy the challenge even if it is frivolous. I would simply call it neutral. Now, if you think I'm being unfair to Juul, it's because I am. He, in fact, wants to know which game structures are useful or detrimental in motivating players to keep playing, and he's only interested in why we play games in general. But I want to know why different people like different games, and why these tastes are more or less consistent. I want to explore how a game can be useful, neutral, or detrimental to a player instead of to a game, as is the case for Juul. I ultimately think there's more value in the relationship between a game and a player's personal fallacies or inadequacies than Juul himself realizes. But this leads into an implication that is a pretty sore topic in the gaming community. Can a game be bad? I think we're incredibly quick to agree that games can be good for us, and whenever a study comes along, claiming it makes us better at problem solving, spatial visualization, decision making, what have you, you won't have to look far to find a gamer self-righteously shouting it from the rooftops. I wholeheartedly agree because I've been playing games my entire life and I'm an excellent person. But I also need to burst some bubbles here. If video games can improve us, they can also indisputably make us worse. You see, the more proof we get for the potential benefits of video games, the more proof we get for the potential harm they can do. That's just the way of the world. But I would ask you to, for the duration of this video, at least entertain the idea that a video game can be detrimental to a person's, person. The trick for many people who dismissed Dark Souls at first was to understand that you do have the inadequacy of not wanting to succeed at something which seems cruel. It's the type of game that is served well by having a teacher. Try the game for a bit, get smacked, watch some epic name bro, get smacked, but with a reassuring knowledge that you can learn. Dark Souls is the antithesis to what I criticize in Juul's book in how it capitalizes on an inadequacy which already existed within players, but an inadequacy that many players resisted to acknowledge. But Dark Souls forces you to acknowledge it. It's what made Hamish Black of Writing on Games make his popular video on how it helped him cope with depression. Learning to reconceptualize Dark Souls' challenges as playful rather than mean-spirited, and through this new mode of interaction cultivate resolve, the player can train away an inadequacy which very much interferes with their real lives in a completely safe environment. And that's pretty amazing. But if Dark Souls can do this for people, then another game might be able to be as bad as Dark Souls is good. But I also want to explore how different players can relate to what games ask of them, so we're gonna need to look at a few different games. Besides, you probably feel like you don't need another YouTube games critic talk about why Dark Souls is the best game. You do, you honestly do, and there's tons of stuff left to say about Dark Souls, like how it's essentially a gamified, non-authoritative version of the movie Seven, or how it's an antithesis to the ludonarrative dissonance and shows us what realism in a video.
Farewell brief. Never was much with words. Once you board this ship, there's no turning back. The next ground your feet will touch will be that of the new world. If any of you have lost your nerve, then step away now and let no one judge you.
There's an elephant in the room about inadequacy as the driving force of why we keep playing that I need to address before moving on. We generally avoid admitting our own inadequacies, and I get that because I don't like thinking about the fact that I can be cold, self-centered, and morally absolutist to the point of driving people away. Like most people, I'm far from perfect. Admitting you're not perfect in a general sense, though, is easy compared to facing the consequences of your flaws in a context. When that happens, we tend to get defensive. It not only speaks to a failure within us, but an ever-present and latent one that results in aversion tempered with fear. Okay, this is getting kinda dark, sorry. Now that your spirits are lifted, I want to point out that the difficulty with admitting inadequacy is important because it's often what leads people to defend certain games and behaviors in them. We could have an entire video on why people behave badly in games, but this video is about a game's relationship to a player's inadequacy. But who is this player I keep talking about? Understanding the answer to that question is key to being able to discuss a game's relationship to the player in a way even resembling objectivity. The answer is a fundamental theoretical field which I'm able to explain best through literature. Don't worry though, it works just as well in games. The crux is one of attributing intent on part of the author and interpretation on part of the reader. When analyzing anything, it's impossible to say with any authority what the author intended with a piece of writing, and it's just as impossible to say with any authority what any given reader will interpret from the same piece of writing. The solution looks like this. We place an ontological barrier between the real author and the work, with an intermediary and purely conceptual entity between them. This way, you can say the author is saying something with a piece of writing because what you're actually referring to is the implied author, an entity which only emanates from the work itself and has nothing to do with the real person who wrote the words on the page. And this works on the other side of the schema as well, with the reader being separated from the work with an intermediary in between. In games, the schema would look like this. On the rightmost end of the schema, there's you, the real player with the controller in your hands. In between you and the work, though, there's an imagined player, which only exists by virtue of the implications of the work. If it helps, you can think of it as the game's ideal player. Of course, any real player can correspond more or less to the one implied by the work, and an audience is comprised of a category of people who corresponds pretty well to the implied consumers. I'm sure you get the point. What's important is that when critics talk about creators and players, we're talking about these two, and never about these two. A good rule of thumb is to run the other way when a critic clearly doesn't understand this distinction. Ultimately, when discussing inadequacy as the driving force of player motivation, I'm not talking about your personal inadequacies, but the inadequacies of the implied player. Now, with all that said, we can move on to Monster Hunter, and its really weird relationship to its implied player. What's the inadequacy it imagines its player as having? That they're bad monster hunters. How does it propose the player repair it? A, by learning about the monster, and B, by working to acquire better equipment. So the first thing to note is that Monster Hunter clearly creates the inadequacy in the first place as opposed to capitalizing on an already pre-existing one. And like I said, that's not a problem, because hunting monsters is badass. The problem comes along when we rephrase its inadequacy of being bad at hunting them as a more general concept: incompetence. Monster Hunter at the start of the game posits that the player is incompetent, and promises that it will allow them to repair this incompetence through A, acquiring knowledge, and B, improving themselves. So far, so good. The problem is how the game represents the processes through which a person does this. Luckily for me, Monster Hunter represents acquiring knowledge and improving yourself through really overt systems, so it's easy for me to show you what the game is doing. Acquiring knowledge is represented through the research system, and improving yourself is represented through the upgrade system at the smithy. First, both systems withhold information from the player. On the research side, there is literally no way for the player to learn anything about the monster before venturing out to hunt it. Now, to me, going in blind sounds like something you should learn not to do on your first day of monster hunting school. And then on the upgrade side, the game withholds any way of knowing what you'll be able to take from a hunt to use to improve yourself. You can't see which pieces of armor you can create until you have at least one part of said piece. And even when you get one piece, the game straight up won't tell you what the other pieces are until you find those as well. Second, the game has a tendency to actually lay out your job for you after your initial successful hunt. On the research side, you need to gain several more levels of research before you get the most useful knowledge about the monster. And on the upgrade side, you only know what to hunt for once you've found the item. So in both cases, once you've finally beaten the monster and carved them up, you go back to base to learn that you need to A, learn more about it in order to get any actual knowledge, and B, hunt it again for several more parts in order to make something actually useful to improve yourself. There's a phenomenon called learned helplessness. It's what happens when an organism, human or otherwise, is conditioned to expect that outcomes are uncontrollable. In the 60s and 70s, researchers discovered that dogs submitted to unavoidable electric shocks. Dear scientists, please stop shocking dogs. Sincerely, almost everyone. Would fail to take action to avoid the shocks, even if that was in fact possible. Dogs who weren't submitted to the shocks wouldn't display the same lack of action to avoid the shocks. This is straight up what happens between Monster Hunter and its implied player. The player in Monster Hunter is consistently conditioned to expect a lack of control. Instead, the player is forced to relinquish that control to the game, to say that, okay, you decide what we're going to do. The game is centered around the theme of gaining competence, but it conditions players to believe that they're not in control of how good or bad they become at something. There's a system that takes care of that for me. In Monster Hunter, you genuinely do have little control over the outcome, but in real life, that's not the case at all. Ultimately, Monster Hunter is a disingenuous and frankly bad representation of the player's inadequacy and how to repair it. And look, I don't want to rain on anybody's parade. If you like Monster Hunter, then hunt to your heart's content. But it is kind of ironic that Monster Hunter World has been likened to Dark Souls by so many media pundits, because they're downright opposites when you analyze the relationships to the player's inadequacy. And please remember that I'm not talking about you or any other specific real person, but rather the relationship between Monster Hunter and its ideal player. But if a game can be as good as Dark Souls, helping its ideal player cope with depression, and real people can correspond to that ideal enough that it does help them, just entertain the idea that everybody who enjoys Monster Hunter is objectively a hazard to society and should rightfully be locked up. Shit.
Menace 1-5, we have a fix on the target. Move to place the X4 charges at the designated positions.
Obviously, many games can be ascribed with the same properties as those I did Monster Hunter, and many other games can be ascribed with the same properties with which I'll talk about XCOM 2 now. Remember this thing, and know that I'm putting these two games next to one another because they're practically polar opposites in the way XCOM makes you fully responsible for every action you take. Whereas Monster Hunter ultimately takes responsibility for the player's progression through the game, XCOM lets the player bear the full brunt of every consequence. It's a sensible state of affairs because XCOM is more than anything a game about decision making, and it lets you handle that part of the interaction alone. In fact, there's a fundamental distinction between the responsibility of the player and that of the game, which is always clear and readable. Decision-making, as far as inadequacies go, is something I think is much more relatable to most people's real lives, and that's going to be important once we get to this. Still got it? Good. Just like Monster Hunter posits that you're a shit hunter when you start it up, XCOM posits that you have no idea how to make strategic, well-considered decisions. In its promise to help you repair this inadequacy, XCOM proposes that you A. inform yourself, and B. learn to consider your options. These of course aren't separate since your considerations require you to know what those options are. But in both parts of the game, the missions and the base management, the two are the dominant modes of interaction between game and player. In missions, you ideally want to inform yourself about what you're up against before each encounter starts, even if that's not always what happens. Once an encounter starts, you want to look at your moves from every angle. Cycle through each soldier and see if they can pull off some sort of combined assault. Look at your options for movement and cover. Look at your options for skill checks. Look at your options for check whatever equipment you have left, and so on, and then finally make a decision that you think is going to result in the best outcome. More often than not, you'll spend several minutes mulling things over before finally finding that ultimate one-move coup de grace that knocks the aliens flat on their asses. It's a slow-moving game, and yeah, it can be pretty exhausting. And then at the base as well, you go through a different version of the same motions. Inform yourself what each research might lead to, look for ways to speed things up, which order to build the facilities, and so on, before committing to a course of progress. The important thing to note is how the game leaves this completely up to you. It dislikes giving you the aliens' abilities up front, it doesn't outright explain many of the mechanics and systems, and the characters at the base even give you comments like,
"I do find that area of research to be among the more intriguing options available,"
without being at all related to what you actually chose. It's funny really, because since the characters will support you no matter how terrible your choice is, it turns into a type of meta snark. As if the game is telling the player, oh no, you are completely alone in this. Good luck, loser. Good luck, loser seems as apt a description of XCOM's attitude to its player as any, because it's really too busy being responsible for its side of things to care about your side. And that's the other side of the responsibility coin, if you will. The game is only responsible for progressing itself through a fixed schedule. As time passes, the aliens will become stronger at specific points, regardless of what you do or don't do. Do the critical missions or wait, it doesn't matter. Be successful in your randomly generated missions or fail miserably, doesn't matter. In this relationship to the player is the most important contrast to Monster Hunter. Where Monster Hunter encroaches on the player's agency, XCOM has absolutely no interest to do so. You want the last tier on the greatsword? No, you can't do that yet, says Monster Hunter. XCOM has absolutely nothing to say about it, to the point of its characters supporting you whatever you do, because it realizes that if you become overpowered, it's because you've figured out how to win. And it's as comfortable allowing you to win as it is beating you to a humiliated pulp. In 45 hours of Monster Hunter, a player is unlikely to fail more than a handful of times before encountering tougher enemies like Nerd Gigante and the other Elder Dragons. In XCOM, a player will likely fail several times before even beating the easiest level. It's often said of these types of games that they're tough but fair, or that it's an uncaring world. Oh, hello, Dark Souls. But I think that's something bad critics say when they don't know how to explain it properly. With the idea of the player's inadequacy as the motivation of play in mind, it's clear that games like this simply understand that for a player to have a chance of repairing it through the interaction of play, the game itself has to get out of the way. The game is only responsible for its systems and mechanics, and the means through which the player can learn whatever is required. It's not responsible for precisely how the player learns through those means though. It's not that the game is fair or that it's uncaring, but that it knows what its job is and doesn't overreach into the player's territory. Dark Souls isn't really fair unless you want to tell me this looks like a fair fight. There's literally 2 of them and 1 of me. And neither is XCOM because the aliens inherently know exactly what to do, they're programmed to know. But a new player has absolutely no idea what anything means. There's also more of them than of the player soldiers. Now it's interesting that both games openly admit that they regard the player as a loser at the start of the game. XCOM 2 with its good luck loser attitude and the fact that the canon ending to the first XCOM is that the player never beat it, and Dark Souls with starting off as cursed, undead, and imprisoned. Okay, so I've likened XCOM with Dark Souls quite a lot, but what sets them apart? I think the main difference between the 2 games are thematic. Where Dark Souls is about cultivating resolve, XCOM is about cultivating decisiveness. With Dark Souls, the secret is to keep going, keep fighting, come what may, keep pushing. And I've explained both Monster Hunter and XCOM 2 as having 2 dimensions to its method of repairing the player's inadequacy, but Dark Souls doesn't really have that at all. Its effectiveness against malaise and depressive tendencies lies in that it shows the resolve as the Gordian knot that it actually is. There is one key, and it's called just keep trying until you win. But decisiveness doesn't work that way. You don't get it by just realizing something profound. You get it by being confident in your ability to inform yourself, consider the options available, and find the best course of action. And then there's the fact that resolve is a loftier, more abstract concept than decisiveness. Everyone can think of a time where an important decision affected their lives, but at least I'm hard-pressed to think of a specific time where my resolve, or lack thereof, has directly impacted my life. I'm not saying it hasn't, because of course it has, but I think the awareness of the importance of decision-making is both more common and stronger in most people.
Those that tasted the bite of his sword named him the Doom Slayer.
Doom is a game about doom.
You know they're demons, I know they're demons. We both want to shoot them in the face. Let's just go.
Your entire job is to kill demons. The inadequacy of Doom can be described as either you haven't killed enough demons lately, have you? Or you haven't played enough Doom lately, have you? And when Doom released in 2016, both of those things were painfully true. But Doom also pinpoints a certain type of game that's a bit hard to talk about in relation to the player's inadequacy in ways similar to how I discussed Monster Hunter and XCOM. It's not about capitalizing on a pre-existing personal flaw, and it's not about showing the player something they didn't know about themselves. On the contrary, you know you like Doom, and you have nothing but Doom to thank for your love of Doom. You can probably use this music to make any dialogue sound cool.
I've been through a lot in the past 6 days, 5 minutes, 27.5 seconds. And if I've learned anything during that time, it's that you are who you are.
Yup. Okay, just one more.
If you're tired of starting over, stop giving up. You should get to the point where anyone else would quit, and you're not gonna stop there. Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday, you said tomorrow, so just do it! Make your dreams come true! Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can! Just do it!
A lot of games fall into this category actually. Games that don't really ask much of the player as a human being, but rather a button sequencer machine. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy the multimedia cavalcade we've prepared just for you. And let me be super clear here, there's nothing wrong with games like this. In fact, as Jesper Juul shows, it's the lifeblood of the medium. It's exactly the type of created inadequacy he's talking about when pointing out how hard games have to work in motivating continued play. In Doom, the motivation is really clever and elegant in how it makes it look so easy. It uses self-distance and self-deprecation to create the illusion that it's easy, just go. And it really is that simple for the player. Don't worry, we got you. Doom explicitly says that you don't have an inadequacy, you're already fucking awesome. Have fun with that. Of course, it isn't that easy for the game, and Doom uses tried and tested techniques to keep you motivated. A really old trick is separating the game into clearly delineated sections, levels, that gives the player some reassurance they're doing alright at regular intervals. Another big thing is game feel, a by now pretty old critical contribution to video game vernacular that makes sure every mechanical action the player makes feels satisfying. Now, granted, the game isn't perfect in this regard. It's got these annoying notifications wanting you to read flavor text that takes the world way too serious and is almost never funny. and it's also got really specific stop you dead in your tracks checklist tasks that you have to do to get weapon upgrade points. Besides that though, it looks great, sounds great, plays great, and the music. God, the music. All in all, pretty basic stuff that makes Doom, Doom. What's interesting is that the game, not the player, is fully responsible for the enjoyment the player gets out of it. It differs from Monster Hunter in how it doesn't begin to pretend you have any control of how that's achieved, and from XCOM and Dark Souls in really obvious ways. And like I said, most games arguably work like this, and it's probably the default approach of most players to any given game. It's probably part of the reason why the gaming community can seem very inflammatory and, well, angry most of the time. We expect the made-up worlds we inhabit to cater to our pleasures because games have conditioned us to do so for quite some time. Now, I'm not saying we do this in real life, but it is pretty obvious from taking a look around YouTube or Reddit that we talk about games in modes of anger, indignation, and whether or not they fulfill our wishes. Be it loot boxes, graphical downgrades, or unbalanced multiplayer, you're sure to find somebody being angry at a camera in their living room somewhere. But alright, this is turning into a bit of a tangent in its own right. The point is, I think we're only beginning to explore different ways of approaching games, and that's ultimately really exciting, I think. A quick word on how Doom operates in this schema. The implied or ideal player of Doom is someone who wants to kill demons. It's really that simple, and it's just as simple the other way around. The creators of Doom have been very easy to celebrate because our agreement with them is free of any complication. We too think heavy metal and unloading a minigun into a spider demon's face is pretty awesome. Now, in reality, it's totally possible that John Carmack is a servant of the Dark Lord just out to get your hard-earned cash. There's just no way of knowing for sure. Although it's obviously true, there's no soul in those eyes. Another game in this category is last year's Super Mario Odyssey, or indeed any Super Mario game. It shares the same combination of using a fabricated inadequacy, you're not at the end of the level, and capitalizes on the fact that we all know we love Mario. A centerpiece of the entire game, in the climax of one of the best levels, is just an unabashed celebration of all things Mario. And if you think about it, the creator of Mario enjoys a similarly heralded status in our minds. It's so easy to see Shigeru Miyamoto as a lovable uncle who loves nothing more than giving toys to kids. But again, there's no way of knowing whether that's true for the real-life person or not.
I'm here.
Okay, I'll admit, that one's probably true. Don't you want to play more Mario? Don't you feel you have too little Mario in your life lately? Don't you wanna? Yes, yes, and yes. I can't stress this enough. This is not a bad thing. The point is that these are the types of games that create an inadequacy which is just an excuse to play. I'm not here to talk about what makes a good or bad game. In fact, I find that a reductive, dismissive way to talk about them in the first place. Every game that exists has value, and a right to do so, except maybe some games. But Noah Gervais already has an excellent video titled Postal Hatred and Weighing the Worth of Asshole Simulators. If you're interested, go watch his video and keep the relationship between the real and the implied creators in mind when thinking about the developers of those games' relationship to their creation. Ultimately though, Doom is a shameless celebration of how awesome Doom is, and that is totally valid. Have you ever played a game that invaded your life like an illness? Have you ever had a fever-like obsession with a game that blurs the boundaries between the everyday and the imagination? Have you ever wondered if you have enough movement points to make it around the next street corner, or whether you're ready to eat your next meal, or if the ability is still on cooldown? Or felt the need to relieve yourself by visualizing an all-too-empty progress bar in your mental user face your life has somehow been organized into? I suspect you have, be it looking for things to use as grind rails close enough to be comboable, getting tunnel vision after being assaulted by colored circles for hours, or catching yourself thinking with portals. Some games have the uncanny ability to extend themselves through your psyche and senses into the world outside. It's not some form of addiction, it's something completely different. Factorio is one of those games. But what makes certain games put us in this sometimes almost frightening altered state, and how can we think about it in Juul's terms of inadequacy and failure? Some of the first questions you might ask yourself if this happens are, what is going on and what am I doing? But don't worry, I'm here to set your mind at ease. What you're experiencing is often called the Tetris Effect, the phenomenon of intrusive thoughts about how to fit things like boxes in supermarkets or buildings on a street together after playing a lot of Tetris. But what is going on? A neurological explanation proposed is that it's a form of something called procedural memory. Now, I'm not a neurologist, so do take this with a grain of salt. Maybe you are one and can explain all the ways in which I'm wrong in the comments section. That said, procedural memory is a term used to describe your brain's ability to automate complex tasks. Think of tying your shoes and how difficult of a time children have learning how to do it. After having done it a bunch of times though, you do it without having to think about it at all. That, as I understand it, is procedural memory. Complete a complex task enough times and your brain will learn the entire procedure and retain it for future use. Thanks, brain! So what's happening in Tetris or any other game like this is that your brain is in the process of automating the complex task of fitting tetrominos together, and lo and behold, you do get better, faster, and more efficient at playing Tetris. If you think this is interesting and you go check it out for yourself, you'll find I'm basically paraphrasing Wikipedia, so again, grain of salt. Your other question, what am I doing, is one I'm more comfortable dealing with. In the field of didactics, which is the study of teaching and the processes through which we learn, it's often said that we, as human beings, are not only uniquely capable of learning, but in fact doomed to do so. In other words, we can't turn our learning processes on or off at will. That's step one. The next step is the difference between two types of learning, assimilative and accommodative. The first type simply adds new information to an already existing mental schema. For example, a baby can know how certain words, nouns, are used essentially instead of pointing at things. And when they learn the word cat, they can quite easily assimilate it into the category where the word ball already lives. But now we get to the other type, accommodative. Let's just call this one the fun one, and the other one can be the one schools insist on. When the baby learns that there are words not at all used instead of pointing at things, like walk, they're going, oh shit, now I need a whole new thing. There's no room for walk in the mental schema with only nouns in it to house this new type of word. So the schema needs to change to accommodate the word walk. That's accommodative learning. Now, the last term we need is a classic in teaching psychology: transfer. Put simply, it's your ability to transfer knowledge from one area to a completely different one. This is what you're doing. Or at least what you're trying to do. Granted, tying your shoes is probably only useful for looking like an adult for once in your life, Jeremy! But in theory, your brain has the ability to repurpose a mental schema for use with a completely different concept or set of concepts. Whenever you say to yourself, oh, so it's kind of like... that's what you're doing. It's simply more efficient to use something already there in your brain rather than creating something new from scratch. In other words, the Tetris effect is your brain trying to find a way to avoid failure, which is really just a more hostile way of phrasing learning if you think about it, by trying to find familiar mental schema to accommodate the new information into. But since these types of games often force you to learn new ways of thinking altogether, there might not be any familiar mental schemas. You can't control or stop your brain trying to learn though, so it pops up in really odd situations without any immediate similarities, and that can feel almost scary. But rest easy, because it's just your brain trying to adapt to difficulty. I'll leave where I got this information unsaid, because believe it or not, this is not a college course, and also I'm sure you know what they say about magicians. When I started playing Factorio in mid-February, I got a bad case of this. I'd had it before when I played the first XCOM a while back. That's right, wondering if you have enough movement points to make it round the corner is a totally true story from when I was walking to the store in my XCOM-fueled haze. With Factorio though, I decided to lean into it, try to feel it out instead of trying to be a normal person. I was talking with my partner late one night, and I noticed that I was drifting away into trying to parse the things she was saying in terms of inputs and outputs, Factorio style. I remember thinking, okay, so she's telling me this thing, that goes onto this belt, and this other thing is gonna come into the assembler from the other side, but wait, which components does the assembler actually need to make? What am I making? And then I kind of snapped out of it. In my slightly mentally disinhibited state, my brain had made a completely inappropriate connection between two unrelated activities. Then I thought about it, and you know, a conversation kind of is like inputs coming in through your ears, combined in your brain, which is kind of like an assembler that synthesizes a response and spits it out through your mouth. Okay, fine, it's a strenuous analogy at best, and it's amazing how I still have a partner in the first place. Nevertheless, Factorio instantly grabbed a hold of me and held me in its grasp, because as soon as I started it up, I went, oh heck yeah, it's a game about organizing and efficiency, and I can't even buy two different flavors of yogurt, because if one runs out with only a little bit left, I can't just top the bowl up with the other flavor. It's a whole thing. I wear one type of t-shirt from one type of store and get really upset when they stop carrying it. Point is, Factorio might as well have been tailor-made for me. Plus, it's got a bunch of cool things I know I like trains. Jesus, I'm literally a 5-year-old. But how does this relate to the idea of player inadequacy and why certain people play certain types of games in a fairly consistent pattern? Welcome to the 5th and final part.
If young Metro don't trust you, I'm gonna shoot you. Beautiful morning, you're the sun of my morning, babe. Nothing in the morning. Beautiful morning.
I've been teasing this thing up until now, because we're going to need what has been said about each game in order to understand why it's so important. So for all you patient people, thank you, and I'm sorry. What this is a two-dimensional graph of a game's relationship to the implied player's inadequacy. There's an x-axis spanning from created to capitalized, and a y-axis spanning from unknown to known. This creates 4 distinct sections in the graph, which I'm now going to name and illustrate with the examples we've established so far in the video. We're gonna go through each game backwards, working our way back to Monster Hunter. With this graph, we'll be able to talk about why people play different types of games and why their tastes are roughly consistent over time. Factorio resides in this upper right corner, because the implied player of the game is someone who knows that they're really into organizing and efficiency. They have a pre-existing felt inadequacy that even though they try to make everything organized and efficient, they're not good enough at it, and Factorio promises them a tool for repairing the flaw. The type of game in this upper right corner is consequently of the self-actualizing type. As I tried to make painfully clear, I adhere to Factorio's implied player in a big way, and it isn't a game I consume, it's a game that consumes me. Other games in this category are Minecraft, obviously, City Skylines, and most puzzle games. These types of games provide a space for the player to just go nuts with their favorite way of being and interacting with the world around them. They're not the only type of game that can induce the Tetris effect, but I think they are overrepresented as far as causes go, because they invade your mind to such a high degree. Doom, on the other hand, lives up here, the upper left corner. It's on the opposite end of the x-axis, but on the same end of the y-axis. It doesn't promise to repair a pre-existing inadequacy in its implied player, but instead one fabricated with the express purpose of legitimizing and motivating play. But at the same time, the implied player is perfectly aware that they are down with this made-up inadequacy. Since the inadequacy is fabricated, they don't ask anything of the player on a personal level that might affect their real lives, and as a result of this structure, the games are of the inconsequential type. Other games in this category are, well, most games, honestly. Think of your Elder Scrolls, your Assassin's Creeds, and of course your Super Marios. Most competitive online multiplayer games fall in this category as well, because there's really no need to stop being shit at StarCraft outside of StarCraft. StarCraft really just came along and went, "Hey, you're really bad at this thing I was made up to be. Wouldn't you prefer not to be shit?" And a bunch of people went, "Well, when you put it that way." There are games which have created a made-up scenario for you to simply take part in. And life can be pretty harsh, and these types of games allow a really great break from all that, so they can ultimately be incredibly liberating. XCOM 2 lives down here, to the right, because it capitalizes on an inadequacy that already exists in the player, but of which there's a lack of awareness. They're called transformative, because they force the implied player to realize there's a part of them that wasn't active before. Obviously, for XCOM, the player is probably vaguely aware of the importance of decision making, but probably not to the point of having explored what it is composed of and how the entire process works. Other games in this category are not a lot of games really. Spec Ops: The Line, Undertale, and of course Dark Souls. XCOM actually sits a little further up the y-axis due to the vague awareness of the inadequacy it promises to repair, whereas Dark Souls is the type of game that sits in the absolute bottom. I also think Bloodborne might be a freak accident game that sits somewhere down here, but let's leave that for another day so we're not here for another hour. So now we've made it back to Monster Hunter, and there's only one quadrant left. This quadrant contains games like Monster Hunter, World of Warcraft, and Fallout 4, and it's called Corrupting. Monster Hunter does such a poor job of representing the implied player's inadequacy, let alone how it promises they repair it, that it creates a warped sense of reality. Now, it's especially important in this category to remember that it's not about a game's relationship to real people, but the conceptual entity called implied player, which only emanates from the game and has no counterpart in reality. You can obviously play Monster Hunter just because hunting monsters is pretty fun and consider the systems around it to be ignorable, clumsy systems that kinda just comes with its territory. That's what I did. At least, I hope that's what I did. Oh god, have I become what I've always feared? Do I even have any control of what I will ultimately become and where my life will take me? Oh god, are we all just cogs in the great machine of society?
No, God! No, God, please, no!
Okay, time to calm down and take stock of some possible objections. You might say that this is all highly subjective. Two players might relate to Dark Souls in completely different ways. And you're right. But the difference between the player who relates to it in the way described above, realizing that, yeah, maybe I do have issues with resolve in the face of adversity, and the one who goes, "What is this crap?" is likely that the first one plays the game and the other one stops and finds something more up their alley. The questions I pose in this video are questions concerning reception, which is always a tricky thing to explore in a serious and precise manner. But this graph actually allows a critic to precisely describe what a game expects of its player, and consequently who is likely to enjoy the game. And it can also help players navigate the increasing amount of games being created. I know for a fact that I tend to enjoy self-actualizing and transformative games, and feel pretty uninspired by inconsequential and corrupting ones. And if somebody described a game like that and told me why, I would know it's probably something for me. Another player, a real one this time, might hate the idea of games being anything other than inconsequential tools of escapism. Another objection might be, why? Why have I just spent an hour watching a video that amounted to this? Well, first off, thanks. Second, because video game criticism has been and still is to a large degree in a terrible state in terms of the vernacular we have to do our jobs. The idea that games media is unethical is ridiculous because in reality it's the combination of a lack of communicative tools compounded by a need to reach as large an audience as possible. This results in pandering to the lowest common denominator with grossly insufficient language. Whenever the development of a useful language is resisted, it just buys time for this problem to continue existing. We play games because learning how not to fail makes you feel really good. But in order to avoid failure, you need to learn better ways of doing things. Thanks for watching. Also, can we collectively decide to imprison every game critic who uses a food analogy?